Your transparency isn't a virtue, it's a weapon pointed at yourself. You've been taught that being authentic is your greatest strength. Machiavelli would see it as your terminal weakness. This is what he wrote in The Prince 500 years ago. Every confession, every public breakdown, every "this is the real me" post is a coordinate. And someone out there is mapping you. A man who shows everything is a man who controls nothing. In the next 20 minutes, we're going to perform surgery on the authenticity myth. We're going to show you exactly why strategic invisibility isn't cowardice. It's the only path to sovereignty in a world that profits from your transparency. There is a generation that turned vulnerability into currency, that made oversharing into identity, that genuinely believes being real is a brand strategy and a personality trait at the same time. Look at what they built. TikTok trauma dumps. LinkedIn posts where founders cry about their burnout and get 10,000 likes. Public mental health disclosures on platforms owned by corporations that sell that data before the tears have dried. The entire architecture of modern digital life is one enormous confessional booth, and the priest is not your friend. Here's what they call this: authenticity. Here's what it actually is: performance. And that distinction is the difference between sovereignty and exposure. They are not being authentic. They are performing authenticity for a social reward. Dopamine, clout, validation. The neurological hit of feeling understood by strangers is indistinguishable from the chemical loop of any other addiction. The platform doesn't care whether it makes you feel seen or makes you feel destroyed, as long as it keeps you posting. Every confession is a weapon someone else can pick up. Most of them won't, but one of them will. And they'll choose the exact moment when you can least afford it. This isn't new. Renaissance court figures understood something this generation forgot in a decade. The silent edge. The person who knows the most, but says the least, owns the room. The nobles who survived, who navigated betrayal, shifting alliances, and the constant threat of being outmaneuvered, weren't the most relatable. They were the most unreadable. They smiled while giving you nothing. Silence isn't empty. It's a trap for everyone who can't stop talking. You cannot attack what you cannot read, but understanding the trap is only half the battle. Later, I'm going to show you the Detonation Principle, the only time Machiavelli says you should be seen, and why most people do it exactly backwards. Before we go further into the wound, we need to understand what Machiavelli actually said about visibility in The Prince, because most people get it wrong, and the error is expensive. Machiavelli's core principle isn't about cruelty, it isn't about fear. The central principle is this: the effective ruler controls perception, not just action. Most people miss that. They read "it's better to be feared than loved" and stop there. They miss the next sentence. They miss the architecture underneath the line. They miss the entire structural argument about why perception is the primary battlefield, not strength, not resources, not intelligence. Perception is the battlefield. Here's the image Machiavelli actually uses: the lion and the fox, force and cunning. He's explicit that force alone is insufficient. A ruler who relies only on strength will be outmaneuvered by someone who knows when to move and what not to show. The fox doesn't win through power. The fox wins by being impossible to predict and impossible to map. That's the key Machiavellian insight that nobody quotes on social media. Your enemies can't target what they can't map. Opacity is armor. The historical proof point is Cesare Borgia and his father Pope Alexander VI. Not the legend, the operational reality. Borgia moved in silence. He built mystique deliberately. He acted suddenly and decisively in ways that no one could anticipate because no one had enough information to anticipate them. He was ruthless, yes, but more important than his ruthlessness was his unpredictability. You cannot form a counter-strategy against a man you cannot read. Contrast that with a more public posture. When a ruler's preferences are known, his movements are known. His emotional triggers are known. Rivals can engineer scenarios. They can position themselves. They can time their moves to exploit the gaps that a transparent person always reveals. Lorenzo de' Medici understood this partially. He was more publicly visible, a patron, a statesman, a cultural figure, and that visibility bought him soft power. But it also created surface area. Anyone who watched closely enough could see where he was exposed. Here's the modern translation. In a zero-sum professional and social environment, visibility is not strength, it's exposure. The same strategic principles that kept Renaissance princes in power now determine who gets promoted and who gets managed out. Strategic secrecy isn't dishonesty. It isn't manipulation. It's the sovereign's right to control the narrative before someone else does, before someone weaponizes it, before someone uses your own words as a leash. You're not obligated to make yourself legible to people who don't have your interests at heart. You're not obligated to hand them the map. Stop. Look at your own LinkedIn or Instagram right now. That founder crying about burnout didn't get empathy from their board of directors. They got a risk assessment. When you share your journey through burnout, your future employer isn't thinking about your resilience. They're wondering if you'll break during the Q3 crunch. You think you're being brave. They think you're a ticking clock. Now let's look at the 3 specific weapons you just handed them. Machiavelli would identify 3 behaviors as what he'd call terminal vulnerabilities. 3 weapons that people hand to their enemies while believing they're building connection. The first weapon is the digital footprint. Every post is a permanent record. Every opinion you've stated publicly. Every emotional disclosure you've made. Every position you've taken. It exists somewhere, and it doesn't age the way you age. It doesn't grow. It doesn't develop context. It doesn't account for who you've become. What you said at 19 becomes a leash at 29. Rivals, employers, ex-partners, people who simply don't like you, they mine that record. Not immediately, not obviously. They file it. And when the right moment arrives, when you're up for a promotion, when you're negotiating something important, when you're building real leverage, out it comes. A screenshot, a clip, a post from years ago that reads completely differently in a new context. This isn't paranoia. This is how power works when the powerful have access to your unfiltered history. Then there's the trap of performative vulnerability. Public emotional disclosure doesn't just expose you. It signals something specific to power structures. It signals instability. And power structures don't reward instability, they manage it. HR departments don't reward your honesty, they file it. The manager who sees you cry in a meeting doesn't think this person is courageously authentic. They think this person needs to be handled carefully. The colleague who hears you describe your anxiety publicly doesn't become your ally. They now have information about where you're soft. And soft spots are targets. The person who openly performs their vulnerability doesn't get promoted. They get managed. This isn't cynical. This is a description of how institutions actually function. They're not built for your emotional truth. They're built for predictability and reliability. When you broadcast your emotional instability, regardless of how valid that instability might be, you are broadcasting that you cannot be trusted with increasing levels of responsibility. Weapon 3 is the one nobody talks about, what psychologists call contingent self-worth. This one's the most dangerous because it's the most invisible. When your psychological stability requires external approval, anyone who controls that approval controls you. Full stop. No negotiation, no nuance. You know that feeling. The 2:0 a.m. regret. The blue light of your phone dying as you refresh the notifications one last time. That hollow pit in your stomach when the likes stop coming, and you realize you traded a piece of your soul for a temporary hit of dopamine. That isn't growth. That's a heist. You were the victim, and you provided the getaway car. Social media algorithms are designed to exploit this dependency. They give you the hit when you post, and withhold it when you don't. Cancel culture exploits it. The threat of public disapproval is weaponized by people who understand that someone with high validation dependency will do almost anything to avoid the withdrawal. You think you're building connection. You're actually building chains. The more your self-worth is tied to being seen, to being validated, to being understood by people who don't know you, the more leverage everyone has over you. The pattern is ancient. Roman commanders who revealed their battle plans before engagement weren't celebrated for transparency. They were defeated by opponents who used that information to prepare. Information is power. When you give it away, the power goes with it. So what does the alternative actually look like? Strategic invisibility isn't hiding. It isn't lying. It isn't becoming a robot. It's controlling what information exists about you in the world. There are 3 pillars to this. 3 disciplines the invisible architect runs simultaneously. The first pillar is information rationing. Share only what serves your current objective. Everything else is classified. Your opinions, classified. Your plans, classified. Your pain, classified. None of it is public property. None of it is owed to anyone. This will feel unnatural. You've been conditioned to believe that sharing is connection, that openness is health, that vulnerability is strength. Some of that is true in specific contexts, in intimate relationships, in genuine friendships, in therapeutic settings. But the public arena is not a therapeutic setting. It's a competition. And in a competition, you don't share your strategy with your opponents. The second pillar is the one-way mirror. Let others reveal themselves fully, while you reveal selectively. This isn't manipulation. It's a structural advantage that every good negotiator, every effective interviewer, and every serious power player understands intuitively. The person who talks less in a negotiation wins. Not always, but as a consistent structural pattern, yes. The person who asks questions holds the map. The person who fills the silence hands it over. When you walk into a room and say less than you're tempted to say, you collect information. You learn who's anxious and who's calm. You learn who talks to fill space and who talks because they have something to say. You learn what people want from you before you've given them anything to react to. That's the one-way mirror. You see everything, they see nothing. You let them talk until they're empty, while you stay a closed book. The third pillar is the Detonation Principle. This is the payoff. Machiavelli didn't say never be seen. He said never be seen weakly. When you reveal a move, it must be so sudden and so massive that it leaves your rivals, his exact words, astonished and stupefied. Not a confession, a conquest. There's a difference between information that escapes from you and information that you detonate. The first is exposure. The second is strategy. Every time you speak publicly, post publicly, or position yourself publicly, the question isn't, does this feel authentic? The question is, does this serve my objective? And is this the right moment? Most people leak their lives in a slow drip of authenticity. Every day, another confession, another update, another performance of being human. The architect goes silent for months, then drops a result so undeniable it rewrites how everyone in the room sees him. That isn't vulnerability. That's dominance. Your colleagues aren't your enemies, but they're not neutral observers either. They have their own interests, their own ambitions, their own read of the room. What they know about you shapes how they position themselves relative to you. The sovereign mind doesn't need to be seen to be powerful. It needs to be effective. Practical step. Audit your current digital and social exposure. Go back. Find every place where you have handed leverage to someone else. Every post where you made your position unnecessarily clear. Every disclosure that gave someone information they could use. That audit is uncomfortable. Do it anyway. The discomfort is the whole point. That audit isn't just about your past. It's about realizing that you've been feeding a machine that was never designed to help you. Because here is the layer most people never reach. And it's the one that explains everything else. Modern institutional structures benefit from your transparency, not as a side effect, but as a design feature. HR policies that encourage psychological safety and bringing your whole self to work are data collection systems dressed as empathy. Industrial psychologists have a term for what these programs actually build: a map of the informal power structures inside an organization. Who influences whom? Who is loyal and who is restless? Who can be leveraged and who needs to be managed out? Your authentic disclosure doesn't protect you, it populates that map. This is what Foucault called the panopticon. Now digital. You volunteered for surveillance and called it growth. They want to know what you're afraid of, what you value, what triggers your loyalty, and what triggers your resentment. Because that information makes you easier to manage, easier to retain, on their terms, and easier to replace if necessary. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a description of how institutions rationally use information. When you tell your employer your mental health struggles, your relationship status, your financial anxiety, you are providing a management profile. They now know the levers. Cancel culture works on the same principle. The louder you are, the more surface area you create for attack. Every strong public opinion, every visible position, every documented emotional response is a potential vector. Silence isn't cowardice in this environment. It's armor. You cannot cancel what you cannot find. Social media platforms are architecturally designed to extract maximum disclosure. Think about every feature, stories, reactions, comment sections, public metrics. Every single one incentivizes oversharing because your data is the product. Your inner life, mapped and quantified, is what they sell. The platform profits when you perform. And here's the part that should make you pause. The generation raised on your feelings are valid was simultaneously raised to be maximally legible to power structures. They were taught to share, to process out loud, to perform their inner life for an audience. You aren't in a confessional anymore. You're in a coliseum. You're bleeding for the entertainment of an audience that will forget your name the moment the next authentic breakdown trends. And that audience includes every algorithm, every HR department, every rival, and every institution that profits from knowing exactly where you are and who you are at all times. Machiavelli would recognize this pattern immediately. A population that can't stop performing its inner life is a population that can't organize resistance, not because it's not smart enough, but because it's too exposed. Exposed populations are predictable populations. Predictable populations are manageable populations. The sovereign response is strategic silence, not passivity, not disengagement, the refusal to be mapped. Here's the distinction that matters. Authenticity as a concept isn't the enemy. Performative authenticity is. Machiavelli would draw a sharp line between two things: genuine self-knowledge, what he called virtù, and public self-disclosure. One is power, one is surrender. Virtù is knowing exactly what cards you're holding. Public disclosure is playing with your hand face up on the table. You can be the best player in the room, but if everyone knows your hand, you lose. Every single time. Virtù is the internal capacity to see clearly, to act decisively, to adapt without losing shape, while no one else can read what you're about to do next. Virtù without fortuna, his term for the forces beyond your control, is your private power that no one else can map. Public self-disclosure is something different. It's the conversion of that private knowledge into public performance. And the moment you do that conversion, the moment you take what you know about yourself and broadcast it, you've transferred the advantage. Whoever receives that information now knows what you know. Genuine self-knowledge makes you formidable. Public self-disclosure makes you readable. The cold calculus is simple. In a world that profits from your visibility, invisibility is the asymmetrical advantage. It's the one edge that the loudest people in the room have forfeited, and that you can claim simply by choosing to speak less and act more. What the architect builds instead of a personal brand is a reputation built on results, not confession. On impact, not relatability. You become known for what you've done, not for what you've shared about how you feel about what you've done. That's a reputation nobody can manufacture out of context, because it's anchored to observable outcomes, not to emotional disclosures that can be reframed by anyone with a reason to reframe them. Machiavelli didn't write The Prince as a manual for cruelty. He wrote it as a survival guide for environments where the rules weren't fair and the audience wasn't safe. That description fits the current moment more precisely than most people want to admit. The final frame is this: the generation that controls its own narrative will control the next century. The generation that performs its narrative will be controlled by whoever is watching. Stop asking to be understood. Start demanding to be reckoned with. Give them nothing. Remain sovereign. If this reframed how you see the game, subscribe. That's where the rest of the architecture lives.